Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? Good. For those of you that are all the way back talking at the far end of the room, I would love to invite you to drift like a turtle in an Abu Dhabi shoreline sea current over to us. We're going to talk about nature and the role of nature, not only in the community, but in business, in finance, in governance, and how we can actually change the role of nature and our definition of how we engage with nature. This is something that I think is very, very important for all of us to be thinking about, because there's a real sea change happening around the role of nature and the way that we approach nature, not only in the carbon and climate negotiations because of the growth of biodiversity and whole system nature-based solutions thinking, but this really growing recognition that we live on one Earth that really rests and relies on nature. So joining us now is Marissa Drew, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered Bank. Obviously, she's going to know something about how we're going to fund all this. And Dr. Maitha Al-Hamali, who's from the Marine Assessment and Conservation Environmental Agency of Abu Dhabi. And she's doing a lot of work in the United Arab Emirates to bring nature into the center of the governance mechanism. And of course, you guys are wonderfully hosting us all at COP28 coming up in Dubai. So we're going to be very excited to spend time in Abu Dhabi and Dubai this December. Let's start with you. Can you tell us about the work that you're doing?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for hosting me here today. It's an honor and a privilege to be here between you all and get to talk about the things we're doing in Abu Dhabi. So there's a lot going on in Abu Dhabi, and a lot has been going on for quite a while. This is not something new. We've been working on conservation for years in Abu Dhabi, and we've got a few projects that we're very proud of. I'll just point a few. I think, I don't know if you guys know what a dugong is. It's a manatee's, it's a relative of a manatee, a close relative. And in Abu Dhabi, we have the second largest population of dugongs in the world after Australia. And that didn't happen overnight. We actually have invested quite a lot of research and effort in ensuring that we have that population and we maintain that population. And we've done it through a number of mechanisms, not just one. We've looked at protected areas, marine protected areas around the areas where dugongs are where we had the highest population. Also, we looked at habitat restoration and habitat protection, because if we don't have the seagrass, we don't have the dugongs. So this is an example of what we've been doing years ago on dugongs. But today, with the climate change and with the change in temperature and everything that's happening around us, we've noticed that there is a sense of urgency to move quicker and faster when it comes to conservation, protection, and restoration, especially when it comes to corals. As we all know, corals are quite sensitive to heat, and we've had a huge impact, heat wave that impacted corals around the world this year. And we've noticed that, and we've felt that in Abu Dhabi. And as we speak, there's a team of scientists in Abu Dhabi scouting the waters of Abu Dhabi, looking for the most resilient corals that have survived this heat wave, tagging them, so we can look at the genetics, look at the dynamics around these corals, and look at the water situation around these corals, because surprisingly, we found a few surviving colonies at waters as shallow as 3 and 4 meters, which is quite astonishing, especially given the heat wave that has hit us. And we will focus on these corals in our very ambitious coral restoration program that we have in place. And we started in 2020, where we're looking at fragmenting almost over a million corals to restore reefs across Abu Dhabi. And the corals that we're finding today that have managed to survive that heat wave are key corals to look at when it comes to restoration. And that being said, I always say everyone is invited to Abu Dhabi to come and have a closer look to the impacts of climate change on the environment. We are a living lab. We are a living lab for climate change, and I think it's important to have scientists, researchers, and policymakers come down and understand the impact of climate change on the environment, not only marine but also terrestrial.
I want to get a little bit more into the work that Abu Dhabi is doing to expand not only conservation but restoration, because I think that the concept of restoration is absolutely crucial for hitting the targets that we need to hit from almost every standpoint. But as we move over to you, Marissa, you were, I want to say famous in the world of banking and finance for your work and your stewardship and advocacy for climate for a very long time. So first, want to say thank you for your many years of work on that, because you were doing it before a lot of people and before it was fashionable, so to speak. But I'm curious, like Standard Chartered, it's an amazing bank, it's a very big bank. What are you doing to actually drive change on these subjects?
Sure. Well, thank you for those very kind words. And also, I'm filled with admiration because I'm in the world of finance, and I always, our job is to mobilize capital, and these days mobilize capital at scale very quickly, but we can't do it unless we know where to direct it, and we need to partner with the scientists and those who are practitioners in the field so that we can ensure that when we're allocating dollars to a very complicated space such as biodiversity and conservation, that we're going to achieve the right outcomes with those monies. But so I'm very thrilled to be sharing the stage here because I think our work is so very complementary. But a little insight into our work. So Standard Chartered is a bank with 59 footprint markets. And we are mostly in the developing world. And out of our 59 markets, the vast majority of them are the global south and island-bound nations, or nations whose GDP is heavily reliant on healthy oceans and healthy ecosystems. So whether it's marine economy, i.e. transportation, whether it is tourism, whether it's the fishing industry, all of these are integral to the countries in which we operate. So I do come from the world of big finance and scale capital. And historically, what has been the issue is that the finance community didn't know how to price nature. We didn't talk about it in financial terms. Nature was always something for governments to deal with or philanthropists. But the reality is that there is no government that has enough money. There are no single philanthropists that can solve the equation. We need to do this in collaboration with the financial markets. So the work that we're doing spans a whole host of things. On the one hand, we view ourselves as those that can help influence standard setting. So something as simple as creating a biodiversity framework that the finance community can draft under is very important, because unless you have market-adopted set of standards, you can't scale capital. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we spent a lot of time on policy influencing. My dear partner in crime over here, who's the chairman of Indonesia, we're working on something called the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, systemic country-level activity to decarbonize an economy, but also, as you decarbonize, what are you replacing the system with on the energy side, and how are you paying for it? And so much of our communities and our island nations, what do they have? The richest assets in the world in the form of natural capital. And if we can figure out a smart and credible way to monetize that natural capital, that helps to pay for the conservation restoration that otherwise wouldn't be able to be paid for. So and we can talk about carbon markets to do that.
And so like this week, Vera announced the new open consultation for new biodiversity credit frameworks, which I'm sure you both are looking at and coming out. I'm curious, just as a little side note, what do you think about that initiative? And do you feel that it's being driven more by finance or by science?
Both. So one of the best ways that we can come up with right now to price nature is actually through some sort of a credit. Because if you have this capital, this store, the way to fund it is to create this mechanism to price it. And the carbon markets are a wonderful way to do that. That's the model. So these days we've got green carbon, we are creating blue, And eventually we will create biodiversity credits. But I do want to caution everybody, this is complicated. And I'm sure my friend, the scientist here, will tell you that fragile ecosystems, the interventions that you do, usually are hyper-local. What grows in a coral reef somewhere in Abu Dhabi probably doesn't work in another location realistically. Soil doesn't really transfer and so on. So we've got to be a little careful with the application. But the concept to be able to create a market-based solution to price, to trade a credit, to create a credit, and then trade it and have a marketplace where we can buy and sell and create that capital, that's what we're really talking about here. But you've got to have science that informs those who are saying the credit really works. It does what it says on the tin. There's permanence to it. There's additionality, all the things that we want to do to create those standards.
Yeah. So, it's very interesting because Abu Dhabi and Abu Dhabi Global Market were really the first people in the region to create a carbon market a couple of years ago. And that is actually having a big impact on the region. Saudi is now looking at developing something. There's a lot of conversation in Dubai about announcements coming at COP28. And the word I'm hearing on the street is that there's a triangle that's between Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Dubai to look at like what we would think of as holistic markets. In Abu Dhabi, I want to ask you about two things. One is you talked about corals, but I know you guys also have a massive mangrove project. And if any of you have driven, and I urge you, it's fun to fly into Abu Dhabi and then go to Dubai if you're going to go to COP and then go back, because they've now grown forests. They're kind of, arid forests, but vegetation from what used to be really like degraded desert have now been turned into these like bioreserves. Can you talk a little bit about that and the mangrove projects that you guys are working on?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah. Definitely. So we do have a lot of restoration projects, and in the UAE and Abu Dhabi, we're looking at nature-based solutions a lot, and we strongly believe in nature-based solutions, and that it is key for combating climate change. And the deforestation you're talking about actually is something that have been initiated years ago. To reach the highways happily, but it's something that started out in desert areas that are not even visible by people, by the late Sheikh Zayed, our founding father of the UAE, where he started the ghaf tree restoration, which is a local desert tree that does not need a lot of water. And he also is the person who kickstarted the mangrove restoration back in the 60s, early 70s, when mangroves were not even a buzzword. And today we continue in that legacy, and we are working tirelessly with a mangrove restoration. And like you said, Mercer, it's important to have financial buy-in, and that's what we did with the mangrove restoration. We have a lot of partners jumping in, wanting to be part of this solution because it is a amazing solution with multiple benefits, not just carbon. So that's...
So
Can we talk about that? Because I'm not sure the audience may even know what mangroves do. So they serve as an incredible barrier protection. So if we think about sea level rise and storm activity, what do we typically do in our countries and our coastal waterways and areas? We put up big concrete barriers. Well, they're not that effective because after the waves bash them over and over, they degrade and they end up polluting, the oceans and rivers. Instead, mangroves actually, because they absorb ocean activity, they act as oftentimes a more effective barrier. But what do they also do? They feed the ecosystem because the plankton feed on the mangroves, and the mangroves, the fish feed on the plankton, and the whole system starts to work. So they're cheaper, more effective, natural solution that ends up creating its own positive ripple effects. And we're starting to say, if we can work at a country level, to influence even something as simple as a government putting out an RFP for barrier protection. What if you said, I want a natural capital solution as part of the answer rather than our traditional way of operating? So you're inviting in those who would then and that will be coming part of that solution. And you just start to think about that as being a way of doing business. We're creating a very new way of being able to then finance, but also create something that's much more sustainable in the long run.
The other great thing about mangroves is that they're an incredible carbon sink. So they actually sequester carbon better than almost any other plant. So you get that additional benefit as well. And that actually brings me to the second question that I wanted to ask you about. Beyond this work that you guys have done across the UAE for restoration, how can others who are out here who potentially are working in other countries, other markets, engage with Abu Dhabi to look about exporting the science-based knowledge that you guys have been developing to work on restoration and protection in Belize? I know that there's a 200,000 acre mangrove project going on right now. I'm sure they would really benefit from some of the learnings that you guys have had. How do we engage with that knowledge?
So there are a number of ways to engage with that knowledge that we have, and the UAE is always happy to support. I think we have quite a great program with Indonesia when it comes to the mangroves.
You do.
And we're very proud of our partnership with Indonesia, because Indonesia has one of the most effective mangrove sinks in the world, and they are already in that research phases and the development phases. They also have. I'm sorry, I'm talking on behalf of Indonesia, but they're also
We're happy to have you do that.
investing in technologies for mangrove restoration, and that's exactly what we've been doing, investing in technologies for mangrove restoration. And so that's on a governmental level. On a more maybe individual or organizational level, we are happy to help. We work closely with the Emirates Nature, which is the local counterpart of Worldwide, the Wildlife Fund, and we also work closely with international partners. Maybe this is not a climate change issue, but for example, we work closely with the Chad government to help reintroduce the scimitar horned oryx, which was declared extinct in the wild in Chad. We had the private population in the UAE, which was moved to Chad based on an agreement between the UAE government and the Chad government, and managed to move that species up the red list from being extinct in the wild to over 550
That's great.
oryxes in nature. So we do a lot.
Can I just
Marissa?
also maybe another twist on the answer to your question is sharing best practice, because I'm so glad you mentioned Belize, because Belize was a project that I worked on in the form of a debt for nature swap, and this was in 2001, we finally got this over the line after 18 months of work, where we took the notion of restructuring a country's debts under the condition that a portion of the proceeds of that restructuring would be put in an endowment to fund conservation. And the endowment was administered by an NGO, the Nature Conservancy, who we think very highly of, because they know what to do with that money and they know what's effective. So working in partnership with science and NGOs, those who really are practitioners, is like the wonderful combination of high finance plus those who really know what they're doing from a practical level point of view. So that Nature Conservancy, with every dollar that gets spent out of that endowment, is learning what works in Belize. Then the next DIT for Nature Swap, and there have been now ones done for Barbados and Ecuador, Galapagos, etc., that technology can be exported and localized. And then another way to do it, there's this sort of do it through NGO knowledge, but there's also best case practitioners that you can share when they're doing work from one area to another. So we are just very pleased to be a founding sponsor of the Earthshot Prize. And Earthshot just yesterday announced their 15 finalists along 5 streams, one of which is restoration of the oceans. 3 unbelievable entrepreneurs that are doing groundbreaking things for ocean conservation and restoration. Let's make some noise about them, right? Because the things that they're coming up with are highly applicable in other markets, and we're going to be all over them trying to introduce them to other countries and other regions and other players and people who can support them. That's what this whole ecosystem's about.
You know, one of the themes, obviously, we're leaders on purpose, and we're talking about how we're integrating purpose into the work that we're doing. The Leaders on Purpose team talk about 5 key sectors or categories. Like, how do you reach your objectives of defining purpose? And so the first thing they say is talking about amplifying. So we're talking about this best practices. The next thing is identifying. So whether it's mangroves or corals and beginning to build on that. Then inspiring, right? I think that's what we're trying to do right now is inspire you guys to take these learnings out, to mobilize and then to action. And so, everyone's talking about COP28 being climate action. It's time for action. It's no more time for talk. We've been saying this, but this year, COP28, the theme is really about putting the finance to work that was agreed back in Sharm el-Sheikh with the new climate fund and driving real action. I'm curious, what are your hopes for COP28 and what does the UAE, from your perspective, want to achieve with this COP?
Before I answer that question, I have one more point on how to reach the UAE. We have an Abu Dhabi research network. This is a very important network that will help us not only support researchers around the world, but even locally, and it's going to help connect different researchers. Exactly what you were saying, Marissa, around the world. So whoever gets into that network will have access to all the other experts around the world, locally and internationally, plus the data and live research. You will not need to wait for the research to be published. You will have access to live scientists who are actually conducting research as you are doing your search.
That's amazing. Is it fully comprehensive or is it on certain areas?
It's comprehensive, and it's as much as we feed into it, we will get out of it. So, but to go back to the COP question quickly, and this is something we saw in Montreal last year. Climate change and biodiversity need to come hand in hand, and that's key. And that's what I want to see in COP28 is amplifying the importance of biodiversity to combat climate change, and of course the importance of financing that conservation when it comes to biodiversity.
Do you think that the UAE is going to be successful in bringing biodiversity to the center of the conversation at COP? Because typically it hasn't really been in the conversation. It would be at a big change, I think, if we were successful in doing that.
I have high hopes that we will be able to do that, especially given that I don't know if you've seen in Montreal. Our restoration project SWAN was selected as one of the top 10 restoration projects in the UN decade in Montreal, and we managed to get a prize for that. So we do pride ourselves in biodiversity and restoration and conservation, and I think we will be pushing that on the agenda.
And just today, I think it's 70 countries signed a treaty on ocean health today here at Climate Week. And we achieved 30 by 30 at the Biodiversity COP. That is protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. That is a massive commitment. And that took really 15 years to happen, but it's happened. So I think this is going to run through everything. It's almost impossible now, in my personal opinion, to talk about climate without having biodiversity part of the equation. As you said, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. We cannot mitigate climate change if we don't have healthy oceans. That's just one small example of why these things it's no longer, they should be talked about in silos.
And certainly nature-based solutions as being perhaps the first, that should be the first stop when we're looking for solutions for how do these things. Our company in Davos this year became the first company in the world to replace our board with nature. We actually appointed the Atlantic Ocean to our board, and we developed some legal frameworks working with the Earth Law Center and competent boards to actually make that process happen. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the business community is trying to figure out how to engage with nature. So we've been talking a lot about the government level, we've been talking about the finance level, but for companies to engage with this whole topic of nature and biodiversity, do you guys have any suggestions for our audience here about things they can be doing to bring nature into the boardroom? That's something that we're very passionate about. I can tell you it's having really interesting impacts on the management processes and the things that we think about as a company, because suddenly there's this shadow in the boardroom that is thinking about some of these things. What recommendations would you have for companies? Maybe start
Well,
with Marissa.
structurally, one of the things that I did is I was very deliberate and I set up what I call an innovation hub, which is called Biodiversity Led with the Blue Economy. So in my organizational structure, which would have been unheard of 5 years ago, I created a stream, and we are an 85,000 person organization. So I'm having somebody run the hub, but it's inviting people across my organization, whether it's a country CEO or a financial markets professional, to come. It's a virtual space to come in and iterate and figure out ways, not only can we educate ourselves on these topics, but also what can we do about them. And it can be experimenting with financial products or helping to influence policymaking or what have you. I think at companies, if you do something like that that's deliberate, to put it on the agenda, but to try to invite in your organization to participate in a fluid way, because nobody's figured this out yet. This is an immature space, so you have to allow people the freedom to iterate a little bit or to whiteboard. The other thing you can do is begin to put it into your policies and practices. So the way you would contextualize that in a bank is I made a very deliberate statement that we will consider biodiversity in our lending practices. By doing that, we're forcing ourselves to ask the question when we're lending money to somebody, what does this loan do or not do for biodiversity? We have climate risk assessments as a bank to figure out the risk of our loan portfolio. We're asking the question with every loan, how are our companies that we're lending to, how are they affected by climate change or biodiversity loss and so on? These are big topics. So I think if you become in your regular way processes, just asking the question, you begin to then go down the journey of how to learn and how you affect, nature and not, or how can you help?
I'd love you to share those questions with us so we could crib them, because I think that's something, again, that shared best practices. Dr. Maitha?
You really think that some of that weight should fall on the scientists to make sure that corporates and financiers know exactly where the problems are and what are the solutions, or run pilots with them to find solutions. And that's one of the things we've done with one of our partners in Abu Dhabi. We've worked closely with ENGIE, which is a electric company, a power company, and we came up with the methodology of planting mangroves using drones. We cut the cost to 1%. We can plant 1 million mangroves in 2 weeks compared to the 6 months time it used to take us previously. So it's on us to highlight these key places, I think, and it's on you guys to look for the scientists who know where to look.
It just brings up one really big point that I think is really part of the ethos of Leaders on Purpose, and it speaks, I think, why we're all here, is also the power of collaboration. So if you're thinking about a topic like biodiversity, as we said, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the right thing to do is. I look to you, you tell me. But then what are the issues that I suffer with as a financier? If I'm putting $1 to work, I need to know that it's actually doing what it says. I don't know how to measure that. So what we've done is then we've invited big tech in, those who are running the geosatellite programs that capture enormous amounts of data that can take a picture and determine where things are working and not working. So then they come in and we use that data to say, actually, this is the right way to go because we can absolutely prove the impact of what our dollar's doing. This is a powerful collaboration, science, tech, financiers, and then, of course, we need policymakers to help us do more.
Can we touch on milestones for a second? This is, you mentioned the 30 by 30 Oceans Initiative. I'm a big fan of the half Earth model, which I think, if you look at long-term, like generational stability of the Earth, a half Earth model where half of the Earth is dedicated to nature and half is used for people is probably the only way the planet will reach long-term, regenerative sustainability. But I'm curious, from your own perspectives and your own lines, within your work, what are your milestones? What are you trying to get to? What are your goals? In terms of restoration or in terms of how much money do you want to move into these markets?
Yeah, sure. So I think in Abu Dhabi, we're committed heavily in conservation. And we do have I think we have reached 30% of protected areas within Abu Dhabi borders or within the UAE, where we have both terrestrial and marine protected areas that are dedicated for biodiversity. But that our work doesn't stop there. And our restoration doesn't just fall within protected areas. Because if we look at it from a protected areas perspective and only from a protected area perspective, that means I'm just protecting whatever is in that protected area. And that is not the way to go. We are protecting all our critical habitats and sensitive habitats outside of our protected areas. These are protected by law. And that's what should be happening. So the protected areas, the 3030 is an amazing initiative. And I think more should be invested in it. But when it comes to the critical habitats and the most important places or the hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, out of these protected areas, they need to be highlighted and protected by law. Full stop.
Okay. So you're hitting that 30. But one second. Are you going? Do you have a personal goal, or are you trying to get beyond that 30, or are you guys happy with the 30? DVD. Marissa.
It's much harder as a financial institution that crosses borders and markets and industries and what have you to say that there's a specific target. We support 30 by 30. We support the big initiatives that are global in nature. We have committed to mobilize $300 billion US of capital towards sustainable finance outcomes, and that can include mitigation, it can include climate adaptation, which we haven't spent so much time talking about today. It can include biodiversity, so that's under the umbrella of 300 billion commitment. But as it relates to specific biodiversity, I'm still at the stage to say I want us to be free to figure out where can we deliver the most impact, as I said, from policy making, standard setting, driving capital, showcasing the best in class, using our platforms, all of that is what we want to do. And it's almost hard to get prescriptive at this stage of the game, because the minute we do one thing, I'm going to push our teams to do something else that's bigger and better.
One of the things, I think one of the general ideas that people have is that there's some sort of cost to protecting nature or to doing this restoration. But when you really look at it, you're actually really helping to embody livelihoods, for human livelihoods. And that's one thing I'd like to touch on here for a moment, because we've been talking about nature and biodiversity, but humans are part of nature, right? We're all part of nature. We got to eat. We want to have success. We want to have livelihoods. How are these projects affecting livelihoods for the communities that you work in? I'm curious if there's been a positive economic impact from the restoration work you've done on the local communities. And then again, I'm sure there's some amazing numbers about the sustainable development goals related to biodiversity and how this, climate finance is moving that forward. So again, we'll start with you, Dr. Maita.
So, like you said, people think it costs money to do the restorations, but in the long run, you actually gain money. There's a lot of ecotourism that's starting to grow around the mangrove forests in Abu Dhabi and the coral reef restoration projects, where people are more interested to be closer to nature. And I think there is that buzz of people wanting to be closer to nature. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your overall health, and it's good to be out there. And that's what we've been seeing. There's a more heavy footfall with ecotourism, but also for fisheries. And like I said, this is not only important for the UAE, but it's for all coastal communities where fisheries is quite a big important part of their life. And actually, with our restoration projects, we have seen a huge impact in fisheries, where we have managed to significantly, through restoration and protection, raise our sustainable fisheries index quite. We did quite a leap in the past 3 years just because of the restoration and all of that coming together. Because another important thing that people forget, that you have to look at everything holistically and attack everything holistically. That's how you will reap the benefits at the maximum. And just to put it out in context, so Abu Dhabi's climate change strategy has a huge pillar on adaptation and ecosystem restoration because of exactly these reasons.
Thank you. Marissa?
So one way of answering your question, and I always think in finance terms, so it's all about the numbers. What I was saying, it's up to now, it's been very hard to put a price on nature. We know that it's affected. We know how much it hurts when we don't have it. We see the biodiversity loss and the climate change effects, but how do you quantify that somehow? There are some very big brains at a lot of the universities now that are actually doing just that. Literally, the whole effects of protection and adaptation from human health, sickness, disease loss, fewer pandemics, the whole lot. So that's one way of going down a path. We also looked at this very narrowly from the point of adaptation, because in our coastal communities, with the climate change effects, we're seeing entire industries in peril. Agriculture, perfect example, right? If you have the warming or water shortages, droughts, pest infestation, these people cannot live and function and create livelihoods. So we did some academic work to try to model this out, to say, if we were to invest dollars now to adapt, to really right now be more resilient to what's coming down the pike, and we did this under different temperature scenarios. So under 1.5 degrees, we need about 30 billion in the 5 biggest emerging markets. And this is China, India, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. The math that we had was, if you invest now, you get a 12 times return on disaster and GDP loss avoided. So it's flipping it on its head in financial terms, but that's a return on investment that's kind of hard to replicate in a lot of financial instruments. So a 12 times loss avoided is real, and that's a price right there to quantify why we need to do it. And it gets exponentially greater in terms of those losses the longer we wait. A decade later, 30 goes to 60. A 0.5 degree temperature higher, it goes exponentially higher still. So this is why we got to do it now, and it's so important that we...
So, thinking about the moment, because Rishi Sunak in the UK today just walked back the UK's climate commitments for 2030 across net zero, across everything. How do you influence an influencer when there's obviously pressures against this action? Like you talk about the science, you talk about the finance. It's like, it seems to me like if you have the science and the finance, you have a really strong prescription for action. But we see even countries that have committed to strong climate action walking it back. Do you guys have any suggestions for how to solve for that?
Look, I think we have to also, we all live in the real world, and one of the biggest issues we faced with a lot of the net zero commitments was as a result of the issues going on in Ukraine, we've had energy security issues. And those energy providers who have found themselves without the natural sources of energy to keep the lights on, to run their factories, to just live the way we need to do to survive, they've had to resort to alternative energy sources, including turning on coal, which cuts completely against the commitments, to decarbonize. So I think we have to appreciate that, urgent priorities sometimes do affect decision making. And at the end of the day, climate's about people. And there's the near-term people issues, like I need light and heat in the cold winter. At the same time, there's the longer-term issues, which is all existential, and it's our survival. So we've got to balance those two things and be pragmatic. I still live in hope, because to me, inaction is not an option. Right? The climate's screaming at us. So we have to act. I have a great faith in the belief that, human ingenuity does rise to the occasion when it's urgent. And we're seeing so much innovation happen. And whilst, yes, sometimes the politics get very noisy and the media loves to write about the bad stuff, what are we seeing right here on the ground? We're seeing, after 15 years of negotiation, 30 by 30 agreement, high seas agreement, just in biodiversity arenas. What am I seeing on the ground? I'm seeing climate innovation like I've never seen. We have seen scaling of energy systems like we've never seen. We've seen cost curves come down like we've never seen, where $1 of renewable energy to produce is vastly cheaper than fossil fuels. IEA, International Energy Agency, is saying we've hit peak fossil fuels with the adoption of EV and so on. So I think the reality is that whilst there are these short-term pressures, in the intermediate to longer term, we will get there. Maybe not always on the same timelines, but we can't wait.
We can't keep delaying it either. From a biodiversity standpoint in Abu Dhabi and the work that you guys are doing, Do you find resistance or do you find support for your goals and ambitions?
Actually, we find support. We find a lot of support. But I just wanted to say that what Marissa said just is all on point. And I think one of the most important things to invest in at the moment is technologies, because that's the only way we can accelerate everything. Even if the policymaker is pushing back, and I'm talking from a global perspective, if the policymaker is pushing back, the technologies are there, they're going to be adapted. And we need the technologies, not only for the science and the research, and we need the technologies for the science and the research because there's no time. Time is ticking. Like you said, it's screaming at us. And if the technologies are out there to help the policymakers, to help the scientists, to help the financiers, I think the policy could be pushed out.
Speaking of
by the
time
way,
is ticking, we have
market
2 minutes
forces
left.
work, right? So if these technologies work and they are breakthrough solutions and they solve the problem, they will be adopted, and the market forces will make sure that they happen faster than we can predict right now when you can't see the technology in front of you. So that, to me, the longest and most important sustainable solution are the ones that are commercially viable, and that's what's going to ensure our longevity. And that's why I do live in hope, because I see those commercial opportunities happen, and then the money flows, and then the adoption happens, and then we're off to the races.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left because the time is ticking, even for us. I want to know what's your one outcome that you guys want from UNGA and Climate Week this week? What's the one thing you're here and looking for?
To me, it's the importance of biodiversity. I want to see biodiversity high up in the agenda, especially with nature-based solutions. And again, to say that we're here. If anyone wants to reach out to the UAE and Abu Dhabi for best practices on what we know, we are more than happy. And also, we would like to hear from everyone, because this is a collaboration. Today, climate change is a global issue. It's not just local. And if we are not all collaborating on a global scale, it's going to be difficult to adjust the pivotal point we're reaching.
Okay, Marissa?
I mean, we're in violent agreement, so that's an easy one. But if I were to try to add one more, I would say I really would love to have an agreement on a global standard for voluntary carbon markets, because I think that is a big unlock for getting the capital to flow and for solving the hard to abate areas, but also creating the ability to monetize natural capital. And of course, I would say that because I'm a finance provider, but I really think if we can get that going, the market is really ripe for scale.
Great. And at our last moment, I'd like to tell you an announcement. So we have an announcement for LOP. Hub Culture today is releasing the first net zero carbon calculators attached to any hub. So those of you who know Hub Culture, you can create a hub and collaborate with it. As of today, you can click a button called ESG buttons, and our AI will help you calculate the carbon emissions related to almost anything that you're doing across scope 1 and 2.5, maybe getting toward 3. But we're going to be working to improve the data metrics for all of that calculation. We'd love to work with you guys on that. But for anybody, like, you could create your own personal carbon budget to track yourself. We could do one for this event. We could do one for a project. We're going to be actually driving all of our partners to be net zero at COP28 and to calculate everything from food to chairs to obviously the emissions getting to and from the event.
On that note, we're planting in Abu Dhabi. We're planting 10 mangroves for every guest that's coming to COP.
All right.
To help you guys offset that.
Well, we should do that together because we'll be driving carbon
Calculate the
budgets
carbon
for that.
sequestration from that.
You would
Yeah.
have to subtract these 10 mangroves
Exactly.
for every.
Okay, but that's great. So,
That's good high math.
So wonderful. This is, I think, the example of collaboration. Hope you guys are going to be driving your collaboration. We're working with super cool Leaders on Purpose and others in Dubai. So we have 3 weeks of activity at the Future Mobility Hub at DMCC, and we hope to welcome you guys again there and our Leaders on Purpose friends for more work on nature and biodiversity. Thank you so much.